For over 1,000 years, the indigenous people of South America have chewed the Ithroxylon leaves. I doubt I'm pronouncing that correctly. The people chewed it for medicinal purposes, but the leaves also gave a feeling of contentment. It was a hunger suppressor and a little stimulant. For hundreds of years, European doctors studied this plant and tried to isolate whatever alkaloid or element gave the leaves these properties. They wanted it to be purified, to be refined, concentrated. In the mid-19th century, German chemist Albert Niemann succeeded. He named this compound with the suffix "ein", and from the local name of the leaves, coca leaves, coca-ein, cocaine. Over 150 years later, and the compound speaks for itself, but it doesn't speak of its history. It exists in nature, but not so powerful or pure. Outside the early 20th century's medical purposes, the drug is kind of useless, and it's bad for you, and it's taboo in most circles, and it's legal almost everywhere. I think some of you know where I'm going with this. I had assembled 100 of the worst crime cases to see what I could find. I refined this compound, broke it down, and presented it. My work is cocaine, and I am the new Albert Niemann. Yes, it exists in nature and should be acknowledged, even studied, but in a pure and refined form? It's useless, bad for you, a taboo, and should probably be illegal. Let's not lose sight of what this is. Well, if the 100 SKP is a metaphorical line of cocaine, then we are at the stage of come down, or even hard withdrawal. I started this project to give me an idea of what a serial killer actually is. I finally feel like I have an idea, and the answer is diverse. There are many types of killer, and types within types, and minds and motivations, and we've catalogued a good chunk of it. In this way, the project has been a complete success. But after all of this, I don't have the skills to interpret the very data that's been accumulating. To put it another way, I still don't know what I'm doing. There's no magical correlation that jumped out, and it was arrogant of me to presume that there ever would be. I documented about 112 tags, and those tags were applied about 1,100 times. Apparently it was trying to be symmetrical, and almost succeeded. But it's still a jumbled mess of orphan data, and yet I'm proud of it. If nothing else, this is a strong project for general trivia. Surely I'm not the only person who found some of this very interesting. Firstly, the most widespread, or the most represented tag was hands down rapist crime. 48 out of 110 were confirmed to have at least one rape as part of their murder spree. The rapist history tag had only a high level of representation, showing up definitively in 28 of the 110 killers. As you can probably guess, the overlap is quite consistent, but not universal. I need to factor in something else. The child molester tag itself has 20 hits. 20 killers molested or outright raped someone under the age of 12. Rapist history also includes previous criminal action and or convictions for child molestation. I should have made the distinction to get a closer result, but let's see if anything surfaces. Rapist history and rapist/murder crime, but not child molesters. Norris, Rizzle, Panzram, Milat, Guy Georges, Gallego, Lonnie Franklin, Long, Lake, DeSalvo, D'Angelo, Hansen, Kraft, Dominic, Sittol, and Zinhai. Rapist history and child molester/murder crime. Curiously, only Daniel Barbosa and Javed Iqbal are tagged like this, and their history is in molestation. Rapist/murder crime and child molester/murder crime with no known rapist history. Ian Brady, Joachim Kroll, Dean Cole, Ramadan Mansour, and Sahir Tak. Just rapist history, but no rape or molesting crime. Rose West, Jack Unterweger, and Samuel Little. I'll have to move Rose, I think that's a mistake. Just rapist/murder crime with no history or molestation. Bittaker, Douglas Clark, Picton, Erskine, Jesperson, Christie, Rolling, Gillis, Cottingham, Pierce, Macduff, Kemper, Charles Ning, Knowles, Nelson, Mark, Wang Qiang, and Mikhail Popkov. Just child molester / murder crime. Henry Lucas, Arthur Shawcross, Andre Chikatilo, and both Pedro Lopez and Luis Garavito. Finally, rapist history, rapist / murder crime, and child molester / murder crime. Rodney Alcala, Peter Curtin, Clifford Olson, Bianchi and Bueno, Fred West, William Bonin, and Donald Gaskins. None of them. There were around 52 out of 110 cases where the killer didn't have any of those three. This was a surprise, so I decided to break it down to see what it shows us. There are two categories in pseudosexual and non-sexual, and several subclassifications within those two. Let's take a look. Pseudosexual. Necrophiles and/or pseudosexual serial killers. These are serial killers that had sexuality as part of their crime spree, but weren't definitely charged with rape and/or were necrophiliacs. Richard Chase, Otis Toole, Eric Cook, John Robinson, Dennis Nilsson, Patrick Kearney, and Gary Ridgway. Violent or sadistic serial killers that didn't rape. Heterosexual. These cases invoke a likelihood of sexual relief via torture, mutilation, death itself, or via a metaphorical penis via stabbing. There may also be a rape undocumented in the case. Wright, Graham, Joel Rifkin, Rader, Peter Sutcliffe, Carl Watts, Gerald Stano, and Chikatilo. Chikatilo has been mentioned twice because were he not impotent, he would have committed many rapes. Violent or sadistic serial killers that don't rape, homosexual type. Greenwood, Baumeister, and Larry Eiler. I may consider Greenwood's position here. Finally, accomplices to sexual crime but not partakers of sexual assault. Myra Hindley, Carol Bundy, Charlene Gallego, and Elmer Henley. Non-sexual. Missionary serial killers not interested in sex. These killers were on a grim mission to which sex was not interesting to them. Ireland, J.P. Franklin, Bunting, the Zebra Murderers, the DC Snipers, Oliveira and Pedro Filo. Hedonist serial killers not interested in sex. These killers are some of the less violent and sadistic, but even if they were decidedly non-sexual. Berkowitz, George Peter, Pichushkin, Onoprienko. Visionary serial killers not interested in sex. Herbert Mullin and Ahmed Suraji. Cases that didn't have a sexual component owing to medical malpractice. Ishikawa, Vicky Jackson, Cullen, Harvey, Hugel, and Shipman. These are all the medical serial killers. Are there medical serial killers that combine with sex? Finally, cases that didn't have a sexual component owing to material incentive. Kuklinski, John Haig, Wernos, Becker, Doss, Sobraj, Corona, and Tagirov. Miscellaneous. There are three left over that I didn't know where to classify them. Terry Rasmussen, and both Leva and Shankaria. So, what have we learned? Nothing really. I'm surprised how many jumped from rape and murder with no prior history for sexual assault, or no known history. It's likely many of their sexual crimes went unreported before they started killing. Hardly a revelation. Personally, I'm more shocked that over a quarter of all serial killers don't have an overt or implied sexual motive at all. There was only one tag that only got one hit. It was Hotel Mattress Body, which appeared with Richard Cottingham. I was sure this would feature with at least one other killer, but I guess that tactic isn't as common as I thought, and for good reason. The hotel receptionist would surely recognise the room booker, even with an assumed name. I suppose it worked for Cottingham, but it strikes me as a very reckless method of corpse disposal. Post-project research tells me that Richard Kuklinski supposedly hid a body in a motel mattress as well. The other tag was Satanism, which I didn't bother making a full tag for since it came up so late, surprisingly late actually. But we know for a fact other serial killers did invoke Satan. Ramirez was especially notorious for it. The incest crime tag got 2 hits, Fred West and Ed Kemper, and zoophilia got 2 hits, Peter Curtin and Patrick Kearney. Infant farming / abortionism only got 2 hits, Ishikawa and Christie, while gambling problem got 3 hits, Wright, Haig and Subraj. It's interesting to see 2 of the more devious cash-oriented serial killers came up for gambling. There were also only 2 hits for family revelations, Wernos and Berkowitz, which I found surprising. I was dissatisfied with the tag Mental Misc and wanted to trim it. I made 4 separate tags that all got 2 hits. Paranoid PD for Kuklinski and Haig, but both of these are questionable, especially Haig. Schizoid PD was tagged for Norris and Lake, as well as Heidnik, whose case wasn't part of the project. These 3 are highly sexually motivated perverts, despite Schizoid PD being associated with low sex drive, so I'm unsure what to think. Sex isn't always about sex, after all, but I dare say these 3 are amongst the most sexually debauched of the project. Shawcross and Nilsson were also described as somewhat schizoid, but weren't diagnosed. Bipolar disorder had 2 hits with Hansen and Bonin, again I expected more, and depressed only had 2 hits in Cullen and Shipman. Again, I've missed a lot with depressed. It's very hard to say what is and isn't depression in these cases. Other low-hit tags include impotence, which was surely a key motivator for Christie and Chikatilo, while Garavito I've already expressed my doubts towards. Forced cross-dressing came up with Daniel Barbosa, as well as both Otis Toole and Henry Lucas, suspiciously. Onto young adulthood, and the bully tag only got 3 hits, with Berkowitz, Macduff and Shawcross being singled out, and juvenile murder was committed by Kemper, Malvo and Philo. Malvo's contribution is as an accomplice to murder, but so many were killed I feel it's worth mentioning. When it comes to taunting the victims and or their families, DeSalvo, Bonin and Moses Sittol did this. When looking at morality pets, Peter Curtin, Clifford Olson and Fred West all seemed bizarrely dedicated to their wives. It suggests they were capable of love, sort of. I'd hope to see more than just wives in this tag, such as Raider's daughter or Ridgway's son, but I don't know if I should even talk about them. The final somewhat weak tag was Grace of the Devil, a rather frivolous tag looking at the luck of the killers. Between Sutcliffe's distracting hoax, Bonning's releasing clerical error, Chikatilo's mutation giving his blood and semen different types, and Popcob's witness silencing mistake, we can see that sometimes fortune favours the wicked. I kept an eye on the sorts of serial killer cases and collected the following. 8 cases which occurred before 1945. 13 cases where the killer was an ethnic minority within their nation. 9 cases of a female killer or accomplice. 7 killers who had more than 2 accomplices. 16 were prolific. 14 were very prolific. And 4 extremely prolific. And finally, 27 killers of non-English speaking countries. Miyuki Ishikawa and Marie Becker were both non-English females active around the Second World War, making them the standouts in this factor. Perhaps they shouldn't have even been included. One of the most predictable correlations is the relationship between criminal history and repeat offending. For example, a staggering 30 killers had a history for burglary or theft of some kind, and 17 killers had stealing as part of their crime spree. The most prolific thieves in this project are likely Panzram, Rolling, Curtin, Pierce, Subraj, DeAngelo, Knowles, Nelson, Tagarov and Zinhai. With regards to fraud history, there were 6 counts: John Haig, John Christie, John Robinson, Curtin, Subraj and Little. For kidnapping history, only 6 counts against a depressing 17 counts of kidnapping as part of the crime. Ivan Milat and the Hillside Strangler duo had both, which isn't nearly as much overlap as I would have thought. Arson history had 10 counts against the arson crime count of 9. 4 serial killers had both: Colin Ireland, Otis Toole, Curtin, and George Peter. Zoo sadism has been a part of the crimes for a few cases, but its distinction is lost amongst adult zoo sadism, 7 counts, versus infant zoo sadism, 16 counts. Richard Chase, Keith Jesperson, and Peter Curtin had both, which again is lower than anticipated. I've covered 2/3 of the McDonald triad, and bedwetting or enuresis is still to be looked at. Only 7 cases: Kroll, Baumeister, Bianchi, Shawcross, Stano, Ridgway, and Chikatilo. All very different types of serial killer. I expected a lot more. The usual issues apply, but with something so common amongst children, it feels, if anything, underrepresented amongst the data pool. I truly believe we need to retire the McDonald triad. It's useless. Although incest crime was uncommon, incest history had 8 counts: Gerald Gallego, Lake, Shawcross, both the Wests, Bonin, Lopez and Garavito all sexually abused relatives before stepping up to murder. I also counted how many killers were sexually abused themselves as children, usually by their own relatives. There were 15. Panzram, Cowell Bundy, both Otis Toole and Henry Lucas, Warnos, Shawcross, Bunting, Rose West, Bonin, Gaskins, Malvo, Mansour, Harvey, Lopez and Garavito. Shawcross, Rose West, Bonning, Lopez and Garavito had both. Shawcross may have been lying. 8 serial killers taunted the police while at large: Ireland, Berkowitz, Jesperson, Curtin, Raider, D'Angelo, John Mohammed and Yavid Iqbal, sort of. I watered down the mental misc tab, but there were still 10 entries under it. Otis Toole and Arthur Shawcross both suffered from some form of pyrophilia, and Shawcross was also an XYY, the only one in the project. This at least proves that double Y chromos are not inherently more violent, at least not amongst serial killers. And Robert Long suffered from XXY. How does anyone explain that? Danny Rawlings suffered from paraphilia, while Bianchi suffered from sexual sadism. I'm not clear what these disorders really mean, and surely many people suffered from both of these. Bianchi also suffered from passive-aggressive personality disorder, and upon revision so did William Bonin, but I've discounted these. The last personality disorder that didn't get its own tag was obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which afflicted Dennis Rader. Bruce George Peter Lee suffered from epilepsy, which I know isn't a mental illness, but I wasn't going to make a tag for it. Maybe I should have, alongside XXY and XYY, but these conditions do affect the mental health of the afflicted. Andre Chikatilo was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which I feel should have been more common. Hugel suffered from some variant of hero syndrome, but that's not an official diagnosis. Munchausen by proxy is also a legally very controversial condition, but maybe it's relevant for Hugel. Maybe I should have put him in unknown, along with Luis Garavito, who was psychotic, but we don't know the details. It's no surprise that antisocial personality disorder was the most common mental health affliction with 13 hits. Alcala, Panzram, Kuklinski, Toole, Wernos, Georges, Erskine, Rolling, Raider, Bianchi, Baumeister, Bonin and Carl Watts. Panzram wasn't officially diagnosed, but I'm taking some artistic license with that one. Many other serial killers were suspected or partially said to suffer from ASPD. With 6 counts, borderline personality disorder showed up more than I thought. Alcala, Warnos, Rolling, Nilsson, Eiler and Chikatilo. Also with 6 counts was narcissistic personality disorder, which showed up less than I thought. Alcala, Georges, Pierce, Raider, Nilsson and Unterwenger. Schizophrenia also afflicted quite a few, but there were 7 cases where it surely contributed to the murdering. Erskine, Sutcliffe, Baumeister, Hanson and Corona were all afflicted, but Richard Chase and Herbert Mullin had particularly vivid variants of delusions. My personal tag of Factor 1 psychopath includes Brady, Haig, Olsen and D'Angelo, and unknown mental illness is still present in 5. Harrison Graham, Rose West, Nelson, Soraji and Garavito. When taking a look at IQ, it seems the average IQ of killers listed in my project is actually above average. Let this be a testament to how flawed my work is. I still believe the average IQ for a serial killer is below average. I just happen to have chosen some intelligent ones for this project. Indeed, 8 were tagged as having high IQs. Bittaker, Alcala, Kemper, Sabraj, Kraft, Chikatilo and Shipman. Charlene Gallego, with a clear IQ of 160, is the most intelligent person on the list. Low IQ killers include Toole, Graham, Erskine, Kroll, Pierce, Watts and George Peter, which counts 7. The rest were somewhere between the extremes. 8 confirmed on the high end of average, 7 confirmed on the low end of average. The rest were essentially guesses. Absent Father got 14 hits, whilst Tyrant and or Alcoholic Father got a huge 24 hits as one of the most common tags. Hindley, Kuklinski, Cowell Bundy, Toole, Lucas, Picton, Warnos, Jesperson, Cook, Christie, Robertson, Rolling, Franklin, Curtin, Doss, Ning, Unterweger, Sutcliffe, allegedly, DeSalvo, Bonin, Eiler, Henley, Chiang and Garavito. I should think among the general population an absent father is more common than a tyrant like we see here. I'd like to propose the theory that perhaps an absent father is better than a cruel and abusive father. The parental abandonment tag sort of operates as an absent mother or both parents abandoning tag with 5 hits, whilst tyrant and or alcoholic mother got 14 hits. Killers that were put in an orphanage and possibly adopted counted 10. Bittaker, Berkowitz, Georges, Rifkin, Bianchi, Knowles, Stano, Sitol, Onoprienko and Lopez. 6 killers dealt with foster care: Brady, Cowell Bundy, Cook, Peterlee, Knowles and Eiler. There isn't any overlap except with Paul Knowles, suggesting maybe the tags should be merged. This at least suggests that serial killers are indeed more likely to be adopted. 9 killers had to deal with negligent parents, and 8 killers saw one or both parents sexualized. This includes Lucas, Curtin, Robert Long, DeSalvo, Ridgway, Chikatilo, Popkov and Lopez. Finally, 5 of them had immediate relatives that committed terrible crimes. Kuklinski, whose brother raped and killed a little girl, Warnos, whose father did something similar, Curtin, whose father molested one of his sisters, Gerald Gallego, whose father murdered 2 cops, and Pedro Fialo, whose father killed his mother. 13 were beaten as children, 10 suffered from head trauma unrelated to beatings, and 15 were bullied. The last piece of trauma is less about malice from others than more tragic bereavement, with 10 killers losing someone they loved before they reached adulthood. Trauma and pain come in many variants. But in all, 5 suffered from an extreme trauma history. The worst was had by Panzram, Warnos, Bonin, Chikatilo and Garavito. Conversely, there were 9 instances, nearly twice as many, where the killer suffered low or no trauma history. Cottingham, Macduff, Raider, Charlene Gallego, Clifford Olsen, Baumeister, Kraft, Hugel and Iqbal. This one especially surprised me and sinks the notion that all serial killers suffered even the normal amount of abuse, let alone horrific abuse. Taking out the self-hating gay men and the obvious paedophile, there are still 7 counts. It seems that trauma history has little correlation with serial murder. The final trauma history tag regards being a social outcast, which may or may not be self-imposed. There were 4 counts of this: Warnos, Bonin, Cullen and Chikatilo. A massive 22 can loosely be described as a juvenile delinquent. 7 have dealt with alcohol or drug problem. 12 of them were homeless. 5 attempted suicide at least once. 5 attempted murder before their crime reign, and 6 can be described as criminally versatile. 6 had been peeping toms of some sort: Rolling, Kemper, Rader, Fred West, Nelson and Chikatilo. 4 were somewhat affiliated with Nazism, 7 were domestic abusers, and 9 dealt with multiple failed marriages. 10 killers had a connection to the army, usually familial, and a huge number of 18 were members of the army or marines, 6 with the air force, and 5 with the navy. 8 had a connection to law enforcement, sometimes familial, sometimes, like with Kemper, Jesperson and Bianchi, they tried to join but failed. And 7 serial killers actually were cops at one point. 4 had some connection, again usually familial, to a medical profession, and 6 killers actually did have a job involving medical work of some kind. Despite me trying to avoid it, at least 4 killers had some connection to organised crime. 9 serial killers had some kind of prison relationship. This includes Hindley, Robinson, Rolling, Bianchi and Bueno, Shawcross, Sabrage, Knowles and Tuck. A surprising 10 killers were prematurely released to go on to kill, or even to kill again. Norris, Chase, Macduff, Kemper, Shawcross, Unterweger, Bonin, Eiler, Nelson, and most famously Pedro Lopez, who hasn't been recaptured. It should be obvious, but do not release serious and violent offenders. Pedro Filo also counts. 4 killers I have tagged as normal: Whittaker, Rader, Chikatilo and Shipman, while 5 have been tagged as having a double life, but maybe these tags are interchangeable. Dennis Rader was the only one given both, and maybe that should be revised. But I suppose there are different types of normal. Baumeister, D'Angelo, Popkov and Hugel were the others I considered having a double life. This entire avenue is an incoherent mess, as other killers had families and jobs and the like. The better question is, what is normal? But the key observation is, some serial killers stand out, others are completely impossible to detect. Over the course of the 100 SKP we had 2 male Bluebeards, Rasmussen and Christie, 2 female Black Widows, Becker and Doss, 7 who killed blood family members, Rasmussen, Kemper, Doss, Fred and Rose West, Gaskins and Philo, and 4 who killed their own mothers or strongly killed mother surrogates, Lucas, Rolling, Kemper and Doss. Rolling might be a bit of a problem because I'm sure there are other killers that played an Oedipal game, whereas the other 3 clearly committed matricide. Sean Gillis and Gary Ridgway also admitted unhealthy feelings towards their mums. The very problematic tag of victim escaped came up with Milat, Sutcliffe, Hansen, Resendez and Knowles. It was also present with Alcala, Kroll, Curtin and DeSalvo. Though many other serial killers had at least one survivor, some of those listed had someone escape and then help considerably in the investigation. Despite what I thought before starting, we had at least 17 killers who crossed racial lines at least once, with several exclusively targeting victims who were an ethnicity besides their own. I suppose America doesn't like reporting on these kinds of crimes lest they ignite racial tensions or inspire copycats. Killers that killed a different ethnicity infrequently include Sean Gillis, Albert Salvo, Bianchi and Bueno, Kemper, Long, Gaskins, Resendez, Eiler and Little. For them, I don't think the ethnicity of their victims was very important outside the raping, robbery and or killing of the victims. Joseph Paul Franklin killed a mix of black and white targets due to being a Nazi. Killers that exclusively killed ethnicities not of their own are Guy Georges, Vaughn Greenwood, Carl Watts, the Zebra Murderers, John Mohammed, Ronald Dominic and Juan Corona. Guy Georges was the only one not from the States, and Dominic is the only white on black example besides the previously mentioned Nazi. This is yet another surprise for me. crossing racial lines does occur amongst serial killers. Looking at the internal mechanics of how they committed their crimes and or covering their tracks, 15 killers targeted hitchhikers, further cementing the notion that hitchhiking is very dangerous. 9 committed crimes that could be characterised as greedy: Kuklinski, Haig, Robinson, Becker, Doss, Bunting, Sabraj, Henley and Shipman. 8 killers demonstrated a higher than average level of deviousness. Christie, Kemper, Sabraj, Unterweger, D'Angelo, Tuck, Ridgway and Garavito all had tactics that made them harder to detect and capture, and most were skilled manipulators. Breaking down deviousness into more specific actions, Haig, Robinson and Cole used fake letters. 7 feigned madness, with widely varying results but all ultimately failed, and 9 killers escaped custody at least once. Panzram, Lucas, Sabraj, DeSalvo, Gaskins, Knowles, Nelson, Oliveira and Barbosa. 9 serial killers posed the bodies of their victims, and 9 used a diverse array of murder methods. Taking souvenirs wasn't quite as common as I thought, with 12 keeping trophies, 16 keeping photographs, and 8 taping or videotaping their crimes. There was a lot of overlap here. Let's take a closer look. Only photographs: Rodney Alcala, Douglas Clark, Sean Gillis, Ed Kemper, Randy Kraft and Yavid Iqbal. Only recordings: John Bunting and, weirdly enough, no one else. Only trophies: John Christie, Joel Rifkin, Robert Hansen, Angel Resendez, Larry Eiler, Dean Cole, Serhii Tak, Anatoly Onoprienko and Harold Shipman. Photographs and recordings: Roy Norris, Ian Brady, Lonnie Franklin and Laken Ning. Photographs and trophies: Dennis Rader and Louis Garavito. None were exclusively recordings and trophies with no photographs. Photographs is the most obvious way of documenting murders. All 3, Fred West and Lawrence Bittaker, seemed to really savour their crimes the most. Of cannibalism, 5 partook, but mostly just to drink the blood: Chase, Curtin, Greenwood and mostly Chikatilo. Joachim Kroll was the only one to really cook and consume human flesh. Necrophilia, by contrast, was very common, with a massive 18 killers having sex with a dead body at least once. Clark, Chase, Cook, Christie, Gillis, Kroll, Curtin, Kemper, Nelson, Fred West, Kearney, Nelson, Tuck, Kiang, Ridgway, Little, Popkov and Garavito. The obvious takeaway is cannibalism is rare, but necrophilia is quite common. 12 killers took the lives of 3 or more people in a short period of time. And perhaps the worst fact of all, 33, almost a third of all the documented serial killers, took the life of at least one person under the age of 12 or less. Equally depressing was that 24 would torture their victims to some degree, and 9 killers committed acts of brutality I deemed cruel and unusual. Rodney Alcala, Gerald Gallego and Charles Sabraj didn't torture their victims as much as some of the others did, but they all did actions that demonstrated a real callousness, reviving the dead, buried alive and burning alive respectively. But of those that'll haunt anyone's nightmares, the extensive torturers Bittaker and Norris, as well as Louis Garavito, took us deep into hell, and Dean Cole did as well. Ramadan Mansour also buried people alive after his torture, and Ivan Milat's habit of paralysing victims is very cruel and unusual. And that's it! As the project draws closer to an end, I feel like the info gleaned doesn't tell us very much. I've decided to make 3 super indexes that combine existing indexes to get a broader picture. I've combined the Pain, Despair and Madness index into one, the Broken super index. Devious and Tactical have been combined into the Strategic super index, and finally the Wrath, Pervert and Depravity indexes were combined into what I can only call the Malevolent super index. After calculating the results, here's what came up. Those who scored highest on the Broken super index were Eileen Warnos, Louis Garavito, William Bonin, Andre Chikatilo and Henry Lucas. It's no surprise the high scores in Pain, Despair and Madness all showed up here, as well as 2 with the highest overall. But if there are 5 killers we could say never had a chance, it's these 5. But more interestingly, there were a lot with low or even no rating in all these categories, and thus a rating of 0 in broken. For many of these it's surely a case of lack of information, but for others it might be the case that they really did have a low trauma history. Randy Kraft and Dean Corll were 2 of the worst torturers, but had nothing in the realms of broken. However, as self-despising gay men, that's a type of madness on its own that hasn't been tagged. Kenneth McDuff was straight and despite some early antisocial behaviour didn't seem emotionally damaged. But the starkest example was Richard Cottingham. No criminal record, no trauma history. It must be a mistake on my part, or the abuse he endured was never verified by himself or anyone else. But that case is quite the enigma. Looking at the strategic super index, and once again the top spot is no surprise. Charles Sabrage, followed by Joseph DeAngelo, Donald Gaskins, John Christie, and then John Haig. Gaskins, who practically embodies secondary psychopathy, is actually a surprise. He was split evenly between deviousness and tactical, and I just didn't notice. As for the lower end, about a third of all killers scored 0 in the super index. The truth is, most of these criminals are not intelligent, cunning, or strategic at all. The third super index is for the most deplorable. The worst of the worst is Louis Garavito, with the incestuous Fred West just 1 point below him. Peter Curtin is 3rd, Lawrence Bittaker is in 4th place, and Leonard Lake in 5th. 6th place is a massive tie of nearly a dozen serial killers. So much as 1 additional point would help them stand out, but the competition for worst is intense. I didn't intend for Bittaker to come out of nowhere like that, himself evenly split between wrathfulness, perversion, and sheer depravity. But what about the other end of the spectrum? If there are bad ones, there has to be least bad ones. Bizarrely, it's Herbert Baumeister and Peter Sutcliffe. No zoo sadism, no arson, no criminal record, no incest or kidnapping, no victims under the age of 13, no molestation, rape, necrophilia, cannibalism, or torture. I can scarcely believe what I'm reading, and I must have missed something. Neither of them count as prolific, and indeed anyone with over 18 kills is modified in depravity and thus malevolence. But there are 2 with an even lower score. The female accomplices, Carol Bundy and Charlene Gallego, are the least malevolent. Rose West and Myra Hindley actually scored higher than Baumeister and Sutcliffe. And there it is. I don't know what to feel about any of it, if anything at all. I've noticed that there's no correlation between being broken and being malevolent, which might be a significant observation, but otherwise I just feel dirty and depressed and really rather empty. I'm not the same person I was before starting this. I wanted to get a closer look at madness and malevolence, and I got what I was looking for. Whether or not it was of any real value, I don't know. But when looking at the big picture, I can see and feel a vital lesson. None of these people, none of them, were special. Yes, you could say some were more cunning, others were more repulsive, a few may have even been sympathetic. But there's nothing in their minds or actions that readily distinguishes them, regardless of what some true crime sources say of some perpetrators. It's a list of unspecial people, rendered previously special when looked at 1 at a time, or even a dozen at a time. But 100 cases? They're not interesting, and they have many similarities and overlaps with others. But the biggest overlap is, the world would have been better off had they never lived. And all that's left to feel is endless hollow sadness, a waste of both victims and the perpetrators. I think the Bard put it best. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Yet those of us in true crime are determined to answer the call of the deep. Well, consider it answered, for now. I'd like to thank anyone who joined me on this misadventure, if indeed anyone else even comes this far. The worst of humanity lined up as cocaine, but life isn't like that. Besides the heroes, there are plenty of good people. We tend to focus on the bad because it's challenging. Let's just live our lives and leave the murderers for dead. This is Bad Place Alone. Have a good evening.